July, 2022, Outer Banks, North Carolina. Month 0. It had been worth it. Getting onto a boat last minute leaving Kildare Island for the mainland had been straightforward, and Aidan Drummond had got on as a foot passenger for the standing deck. The weather had been kind, and he had not been drenched by the sudden storms that passed over the seaport, so he could enjoy a rare moment looking at the marshlands, at the birds, hearing the cicadas as they squeaked into the evening night, Friday night, and he could sleep on the boat for the few hours it would take to get to Charleston, South Carolina, and then go to an all-night diner and wait until the government buildings were open and he could begin his investigations. And it had all worked out, even if he had not found anything. Not that he had found much, but at least he had known where not to look. The museum had been his first call, to read the official tourist information about the infamous Blackbeard, and he had wandered through with the rest of the Saturday visitors, nodding to the ticket official and handing over $25, a guidebook. The bored-looking cashier. Aidan handed over another $10 and took the book from her, burying his head into it immediately. A lot about Blackbeard, about Edward Teach and his piracy, based as he had been in Nassau, and his blockade at Charleston, taking prisoner the townspeople. More about Stede Bonnet, after whom so many places were named, and about his hanging, for which people in the town petitioned the governor, Robert Johnson, to save him. Stede Bonnet, gentleman pirate, was the town's tourist attraction, not Blackbeard, who had been killed off the coast of Virginia. In the end, after mingling with tourists, and finding out not much more than the Wikipedia page, Aidan conceded that at least he now knew where not to look. The Blackbeard story consisted of first-hand accounts of the townspeople who had been taken ransom when Edward Teach had barricaded the port in order to procure medicine for his crew. Did you know that it was the first use of the skull on a black flag? A keen young man said to Aidan. Aidan turned to see the wide smile of someone whose day had been made just that little bit happier because he had shared that fact. No kidding, Aidan said, in a dreadful rendition of an American accent. He had practiced several times, but sometimes, when he was surprised into speaking, it came out a bit mangled. And, the man said, happily, it was used to lure in the governor's men, to give them food. He stuck out his hand. Barney, he told Aidan. Aidan replied, and took Barney's hand, shaking it. Pleased to meet a fellow enthusiast. I am, Barney told him, and he gave Aidan another smile. I like this museum a lot. Say, are a senior? I'm a senior. Aidan did a brief calculation. So many pupils in British schools left to go to training colleges or employment that he had to remember that in America, most young people didn't leave until they were 18. Aidan told him, glancing to the clock. He had to be at the Limbrae solicitors that afternoon. There was something he needed to discuss. However, he had no desire to get there too quickly. The place gave him the creeps, and Aidan had been glad to get out of there last time. Eventually, Barney the senior and museum enthusiast ran out of things to say to Aidan and, with a quick parting bye, he left through a wide archway that had a sign above it that said, Paleontology, let the dinosaurs keep you busy. Aidan thought, as he brooded on the afternoon, he really wasn't looking forward to going to King Street again. Aidan sat in the central gallery and sipped on a bottle of water, looking round at the high arches, as the number of visitors in the museum's atrium gradually thinned, as the sun made dappled images around the white, cool walls. A very pleasant place to rest, to think. And, Aidan thought, he wasn't using his time well, sitting here, enjoying the rest, as opposed to the camp bed from which he had to usually prise himself at dawn each morning, which he rented from the Brooks family, who had been happy to rent it to him when he explained he was here to look for his family, who had been interested in the wreck of the Royal Merchant. It seems like everyone in the world comes to Kildare for that, Joe Brooks had told Aidan, when he had helped the man out cleaning a backlog of rental boats. Just what was your father's name, again? I don't know, Aidan had lied, but he knew Ward Cameron. The man who just died? Mr. Brooks had simply nodded, and said nothing more, just like everyone when Aidan asked about Ward Cameron. But the Brookses had vouched for Aidan, and had called him over and sat him down, breaking the news that had come when Ward Cameron, along with John Rowledge, had died in South America, and, what's more, the El Dorado gold had been found. So, Rafe Cameron had taken Aidan on, far too distracted on his own affairs, a body being brought back home, his sister, Sarah, who had been there when it had happened and was an emotional wreck, on his stepmother, Rose, who had decamped to the family home in Aruba and would not talk to him, and on his little sister, Wheezy, who had been sent away to boarding school. He had been unnoticed, a pair of hands to add to the other pairs of hands in service at Tannehill, and that had suited Aiden just fine, especially when he was paid in cash and no questions were asked about tax or social security numbers, which was ideal for him, because he could go about unnoticed and, potentially, find out anything he wanted. And what he wanted was the extent to which Ward Cameron had been involved in his father's and Carla Limbrey's visit to Britain, and to Bristol in particular. "The museum will close in 10 minutes, came a voice from a tannoy. Aiden looked round, and saw the brisk walking of the people around him towards the exit. But, Aiden told himself, thinking about the answers to the questions he had would not get him Blackbeard's logbook, nor the skull, and there had been no record of that in the museum, nor had there been any mention of Blackbeard's treasure that had, inexplicably, been left at Charleston. Blackbeard had it with him before getting to Charlestown, yet, when his ship was ambushed in 1718 by the governor of Virginia, there was none to be found. Like others, Aiden realized, the conclusion was that it had been left behind in Charleston, buried, hidden, before he tracked the coast north. Aiden glanced glance at a colonial display, and he knew that he was putting off his second reason to be in Charleston. His mother had been the one to put it into words, the mother he had met, just once, and had welcomed him as her child. Afterwards, he had been possessor of the vast Limbrey wealth, as he had been escorted to 27, King Street, a stiff-faced solicitor explaining that he was her sole heir to millions. Why should he not have taken it, millions in his hand, rather than poverty in search of other millions? Because he was there illegally, of course, having gone aboard a private ship down the Avon to that haven of tax avoidance, the Scillies, before heading down to the Canaries and into the Atlantic. Drugs were the game, cannabis and opioids, put down in the Azores by a big smuggling chain. The captain, a chain-smoking, fishnet vest-wearing man in his 50s, asked no questions when Aiden turned up in early hours of the morning, offering money for his passage. The man had refused the money on the basis of its traceability, but had agreed in exchange for labor, and Aiden had nearly been caught off the coast of Barbados. But there, he had caught a break and had managed to get aboard a fishing boat that had ended up in the Outer Banks, and had bought his money for some dollars, far below the exchange rate, wishing Aiden luck. The solicitor had known all this, or rather, Ward Cameron had, for he had been there when Aiden had left Carla Limbrey's side and had escorted him to King Street. "You will be arrested as an illegal migrant, and deported," he had told Aiden, "except that both of my parents are American citizens and I was illegally adopted." Aiden had shot back, "I placed you there, and I can make you exactly as I want you," Ward had told him. The solicitor had risen, then, and Ward had taken a step away from Aiden. Perhaps Aiden Drummond should have known that he was in himself more important to Ward Cameron than he knew. "You cannot have the money," the solicitor told Aiden, "nor the estate, nor the assets, but you can have her name and a legitimate position in the Limbrey line, be recognized as her child, and, you can determine where her money and assets will go." There was no question. He had found out about a family who had been slaves to the Limbreys. Let them have it, Aiden had told Jack Hall, and the solicitor had noted it, and Aiden had declared that he would leave now, with his hundreds of dollars from the rip-off exchange rate still in his pocket, because, he realized, this was the only chance he had to leave without Ward Cameron tracking him down. And he had returned to the Brookses, and continued his work on the hire boats, hearing from Janet that Ward had been accused of murdering the local sheriff and had got away from the police on his private plane. So many nights since he had wondered whether he could have fought it, whether he could have claimed his mother's millions. Why had he not? Because this was not his life. This woman, his mother, was not his family. He had not grown up in America, not in places like Charleston, which was all that Aiden had imagined it to be, colonial houses like a TV miniseries, wide avenues with white pavements and tall trees. His life had been cul-de-sacs and housing estates, the wide Avon River and the little rowing boats that were tethered to its sides. Here was not Bristol. And yet, as one city, along with Glasgow, Liverpool and Dublin, grew rich on the back of the slave trade. But the thought remained in Aidan's mind as he stepped outside of the museum and blinked into the bright sunlight. A blue jay landed on the cables overhead, its fluttery movement catching Aidan's eye for a minute. He still had business in King Street, despite signing away all of the Limbury money, and he knew he could not lollygag any longer. The solicitor was waiting, as if expecting him. Jack Hall, Property and Estates Law, Stamford, or so said the plaque on the door. Last time, it took only a few minutes. With a pen and a piece of paper, and Aidan Drummond could have been the richest man in the state of North Carolina. He wondered, idly, if the beneficiary of the money knew about it yet. 88,888,888. But if the Limbury estate had the captain's logbook of the Queen Anne's Revenge or knew the whereabouts of Edward Teach's skull, then Mr. Hall would not say. He merely placed one final set of papers in front of Aidan, who looked over them, and nodded. His father, his name was written before him. He had written to Ward Cameron in 2002, and Ward had arranged the private adoption in Bristol. Mr. and Mrs. Drummond were not chosen by accident, it seemed, and Aidan left with an acute sense that he was meant to be there, looking for Blackbeard's treasure. For Drummond had been an alias that Edward Teach had once used. The cynical part of Aidan's brain told him that, not only were his adoptive parents not chosen by accident, but that they had been chosen well and truly on purpose and paid a lot of money for the privilege. There is no record of the log in Carla's effects, and the skull, I am sorry to say, is just a legend. Mr. Hall told Aidan, if a skull had been used in the 30s, it was some other poor unfortunate soul. The Civil War? Was there a lot of action around here? Aidan asked, with the ignorance of a person who had never grown up in America. And Jack Hall had explained that the wars had happened further north, and had happened because a confederacy of states wanted to be independent. Considering independence of nations seemed to be a good thing these days and unionism deemed fascist, it occurred to Aidan that it was strange that there was a time that the opposite was seen as true. And, of course, it was the old connections in Britain that came into force again. The British Empire supported the Confederate States, of course, sent them money and men. Ancient ties? Aidan asked. Jack Hall gave him a pitying look, and at once, he realizes that he had said something naive. Money. Jack Hall laughed, and slapped his desk. Then he fixed Aidan a look. If you want to be successful in this world boy you only need to ask who it is will benefit from any situation financially, and you'll have solved most of any question you have. He got to his feet and took Aidan's hand. Go straight, he urged Aidan, be who you really are, and things will get better for you. Surely it's better than slumming it in a boat shed? But Aidan had thanked the man and left Mr. Hall talking about an immediate family visa. 88,888,888. Shortly afterwards, Adeline Limbury, Carla Limbury's only daughter, emerged from King Street and was followed by a man in the pay of Rafe Cameron. 88,888,888. Sitting in the all-night diner again, Aidan thought about it was all that he had wanted. What he wanted, right now, was to go over to the phone box on the corner of the street and give his best friend, Doogie Morn, on the number for his dad's minicab business. His life would change forever, if he did that, for he would be traced, for sure. And, while Ward Cameron could no longer use the threat of the law as blackmail, he was even more exposed. His adopted family, the Drummonds, were supposedly related to Edward Teach. It was one of the things Aidan had held close to his heart when he did the local history of Bristol at his primary school. He had taken the information home excitedly and first told his mother and then his father. His father had looked up from his books of coins that he had discovered from metal detecting, and called Aidan close, sitting him down next to him, and saying, yes, perhaps. He watched Aidan's face light up at the excitement, and Aidan thought, as he asked for a second coffee from the tired-looking waitress, that he remembered them both not being as thrilled as he thought they would be at the news. Looking back, perhaps it was too close to the truth for them, whatever the truth was with his real father, with Carla Limbury and with Ward Cameron, who had, apparently, been in love with Carla. Perhaps that was something Aidan should have led with the last time he had seen Ward. when Ward was trying to coerce him into doing what he wanted. And so, after visiting another cafe and waiting until opening time, Aidan Drummond returned to another museum, the Patriots Point Maritime Museum, which felt very much like Bristol to him, a ship being a ship anywhere, and the hands aboard doing the same job. At lunchtime, Aidan crossed to City Hall, looking at the historical records and archives of the city, fudging the fact that he had not, of course, booked in advance, and sweet-talked the archivist into opening up for him anyway, pulling out the gold sovereign on his chain as the Sunday evening's light fell onto its facets. Aidan looked again upon the face of Queen Anne, who looked as rigid and regal as always, insistently had left, like whatever was keeping her attention there was far too important that she would look at him. Get in, urged the skipper of the large ferry that was about to leave the eastern dock at Charleston. From here, it was a 3-hour journey to the Outer Banks, and then Aidan would need another ferry to get to Kildare. The rain really had whipped up, and he put his hand inside his denim jacket, feeling for the zip, that it was still closed. That was where the document was that he had stolen from the archives at City Hall, where the enthusiastic clerk had told him about the pirate history of the Carolinas. "Do you know about Blackbeard's blockade, Charleston?" she had asked him, her small, slim face crinkling up as she asked him the question. "No, ma'am, I do not," Aidan lied, and used the time to focus on getting hold of the document that was lying on top of a leather folder in which official documents of all the governors of North Carolina lay. This one appertained to the dates 1928 to 1936, and would surely lead him to the name of the man who was said to be in possession of Blackbeard's skull. The writing was too flowery to read, so he had stolen it instead. "We will be breaking our journey at the port of Wilmington," a voice over the tannoy came, as the wind blew on deck, rattling the windows that passengers had hastily opened to try to improve the oppressive conditions inside the ferry. It was busy, now, for no one was outside on deck. Rain poured over the rail and washed out to sea again as the ferry slowed towards its temporary destination. Wilmington was somewhere Aidan had heard about before too, another pre-independence settlement. He seemed to think he remembered being told that a lot of the settlers here had been reluctant to give up Britain and the crown around this part of North Carolina. The storm raged more, whipping overhead power lines, and Aidan chose to stay aboard the Louisa rather than brave it, like some of the passengers. Clearly it was weather they were used to. Instead, he pulled his jacket around his shoulders and wished he had a blanket and a hot cup of tea. Sometimes, he really missed a cup of tea. It just didn't taste the same in America. Somehow, before long, the ferry was underway again and was skirting the coast to Wilmington, got to the chain of islands that began the Outer Banks and had gone into Pamlico Sound around Portsmouth Island, went for shelter at the north coast of Cedar Island. The storm was, indeed, getting worse, and this time, the ferry seemed to be in trouble. It yawed and creaked in the fight of the storm, until it was thrown onto the coast, onto which it was aiming with a sickening crunch. The tannoy opened up again and an announcement was made that all passengers should remain where they are until further notice. "There is no cause for alarm, your safety is our priority." That was fair enough, Aidan thought to himself, but he needed to get back. If he didn't turn up, Sam Henrys, the groundsman at the Tannehill estate, would notice. Aidan had lawns to mow after all, though probably flood cleanup by now. Plus, he had information to find, which should be easier now Ward Cameron had met his end. Rather than dealing with the gaslighting, Machiavellian when he was alive, actually dead, this time, no fake funeral in sight, an open casket and buried on the mainland. He hoped the loss of the man would pass soon. Aidan didn't know how many times he could bear to see Sarah Cameron mope about it. Was it normal? Aidan has felt numb when his parents, his adoptive parents, had died, but not this gut-wrenching sickness that this girl was exhibiting. And he couldn't even say it was a girl thing. Rafe Cameron had gone from a cocky young man into a mood deep brooding. He didn't even bother with his drugs anymore. Indeed, word on the street was that the local drug dealer was suffering from his lack of business to country club. "Anyone for Oracoke? We are taking a boat out in half an hour," called a voice from the stern of the ferry. Aidan turned his head. "Yes," he called, and pushed his way to the front of the people. So un-British-like. But it was dog-eat-dog here, and sharp elbows were the way forward. At least he would be on the right island and he could hitch up the coast, turn up in the early hours of the morning, try and get a bit of kip where he could. In fact, the small motorboat carrying about a dozen people who wanted to be on the OBX crossed the Sound and to the western strip of the larger island north of Oracoke, the derelict lighthouse looming over them as they got out. Aiden watched as the motorboat zoomed out across the water in the failing light, in the July air, now recovering from the storm that had passed over it. Before turning north, he was on the cut, and nearer to the Brooks house than he had imagined. Not wanting to disturb them, for he was not due back until after work the next day, Aiden looked around for somewhere suitable to crash, inching north and further north, looking for a cave or a bay. But the land was not like that here. The beach was sandy and flat, and the houses, shacks covered by thin canopied mangrove-type trees, were occupied with people screaming at one another, motorbikes howling and outdoor fires burning. Aiden walked on, figuring he could sleep in one of the boats until the morning. It was decided, and he walked on. It would take an hour, he thought, not too long on what was now a good evening. But a better opportunity came in the form of a burned-out house and outbuilding, and Aiden chose the sheltered walls of what looked like something that had been a barn. He drew his knees up to his chest, and mentally went through his list of things to do, as he did every night. First, the Queen Anne's Revenge captain's log, to find mention of the treasure, and where it might have ended up. Second, the skull of Edward Teach, and the link to the governor's dinner party in the 1930s. Ward Cameron's involvement in Aiden's adoption, and finally, to find out more about his real father, whose name Aiden now knew but could hardly bear to even repeat in the seclusion of his own head. 88,888,888. Aiden's eyes opened to a click. Someone pointing a gun at him. After blinking for a couple of times, Aiden looked at the weapon, his first feeling being that it was not real. In the dawnlight, it looked just like a plastic gun he had once had in a cowboy dressing-up set. But the second click got Aiden's attention. This was no children's toy. "What are you doing on my property, you little punk?" Aiden opened his eyes a little more. A boy was standing over him, a young man. He knew him. He was over at the Tannehill house, friends with John B., friends with Sarah. The name of this person floated in the front of his mind, but it would not settle for Aiden to read it. A pogue. Nevertheless, he had a bottle of Jack Daniels in the other. Although it was a clear, colorless liquid, looked as if the bottle was being reused for another spirit. His face was grubby, but that did not stop Aiden notice that he was extremely good-looking. Aiden's mind flicked back to Douglas Morn. Doogie was his best friend, and they, too, would sit mournfully looking out to sea and drinking. But JJ, here, now, looked as if he had the given-up look of life, which was tearing at Aiden's heart as he looked at the boy, 18 or so, similar age to Aiden, but as if all the hope of life had long ago left him and he was clinging on to life as if it were a prison sentence, and the release would come from death. We, began Aiden, trying to move stiff muscles. The flick of the young man's head told him to stay put, but Aiden has not brought himself up in the back alleys of Hillfields, barking dogs and burnt-out cars surrounding them as they did a bunk after a raid on the local corner shop. Doogie beside him, fighting dirty and running from the police. There was a storm, Aiden told him. The youth glared at him, the gun remaining where it was. "Come on JJ, he was only sleeping," came a voice behind the boy. Aiden glanced up. It was another person he recognized. Key, or something, dark curly hair sticking to the side of her head. It looked as if she had slept out of doors too, and Aiden moved his head, looking at the burned-out house, sides coming up a little higher, like a bird's nest. There were blankets and belongings on the ground floor. Perhaps there, JJ, Aiden thought, looking back to the young man, John B.'s best friend, soft drugs dealer and would-be ASBO holder, had he lived back home. Doogie had two to his adopted mother's dismay. Aiden a drum and had one. "Key," Aiden said. The girl turned her head. "Do I know you?" she asked uncertainly. Now was the time to move. Aiden knew. This Key was not a rough kid. She came from money but had chosen her life. She was the key to getting out of the gun-in-the-face situation. "You are friends with Sarah Cameron," Aiden told her. "I have seen you at Tannehill," and he had. But since their return, and the investigation into their claim of El Dorado, They were apart more than they were together, and JJ, rather than sleeping under the roof of Mr. and Mrs. Carrera, as had been the arrangement with Kiara's grateful parents, Aiden had overheard all of it over several nights sitting on the patio as the Pogues had spoken of their exploits. More often than not JJ had returned to the shell of his former home, speaking in quietish whispers to one another. It was another thing Aiden had learned, not relevant, of course, but inevitable. God, they liked to natter, didn't they? All the people he had come across in North Carolina did. "You've been to Tannehill?" he asked, taking a step towards Aiden. "I've been inside looking for information on my adoption in as many desk drawers, cupboards and secret passages as I could find," Aiden told himself, aloud, making sure he did not look at JJ, lest the young man thought he was nervous. Said Tiki, "I work there." There it was, the surprise, Aiden noticed. He saw her glance to JJ, and added, as he moved with surprising speed in a leap towards JJ's ankles, giving him a hard side swipe, "We were shipwrecked." "I thought this was derelict." It looked derelict. JJ fell, his arm falling back and the gun going off into the air. Aiden ran, and had got to the strand line before JJ's pursuit was successful. Behind him, after a lot of swearing, a motorcycle started up. Aiden glanced behind him. A furious JJ was pursuing him on one, cigarette in mouth. He gunless however, but gaining, and threw aside the bike when he got to the beach, throwing himself at Aiden's denim-clad legs. Both of them landed in the soggy sand and JJ began to thump the back of Aiden's head. Blood poured down his neck. The youth was wearing knuckle dusters. "My face will be pounded to pieces if I don't get away from him," Aiden thought as the blows came faster. At a distance, he could hear Kiara's voice shouting at them, her words indistinct. Not that he could concentrate on them anyway. JJ was too busy trying to make a hole in the back of Aiden's skull. An elbow in the ribs at least paused the blows, and JJ fell back, taking Aiden's shirt with him. The buttons tore, and Aiden turned, getting in an uppercut that knocked JJ's head back. Then he turned, and Aiden threw himself onto JJ, about to land a punch in return, but saw that the young man was raising his hand again. Aiden lunged forward, opening his mouth, his teeth clamping around JJ's wrist. He tasted salt and sweat. JJ yelled at the pain and Aiden bit harder, landing a few lunches to JJ's face. The knuckle duster hand flopped back, and Aiden leaped aside, sorely tempted to knee him in the bollocks, as blood from the pounding he had had dripped his arm and soaked into his ruined shirt. "JJ!" screamed Ki, looking between Aiden and JJ. Aiden backed away. He wasn't coming after him. Aiden pulled on his shirt, pulled it back up towards his neck. A hot ice chill poured down his spine, wondering if his cover had been blown, before turning, not waiting to find out. Then, he ran with all the strength he had up the beach and towards the Brooks boat hire, a gunshot ringing past him as he fled. It was the first time Aiden Drummond's path and the paths of the OBX teens would cross, and it would not be the last. Now, though, as dawn began to win over darkness, he stumbled into a shower and into a fresh change of clothes, washing the blood out of his hair, and then thoroughly out of the shower, knowing that in a couple of hours, he would be up and on his feet and sailing one of the Brooks's boats over to Figure 8 to begin work. 88,888,888. Who is that? Kiara Carrera asked her boyfriend. She approached him tentatively, sitting as he was in the damp sand, his hand bruised from using the knuckle duster. It sat in the sand beside him. "I don't know, but the bastard cut me." He held up his wrist to show Kiara the bloody bite mark. "I am going to find out, and when I do," he cocked the gun that he had indeed brought with him, aiming it in Aiden Drummond's wake. "He's dead." "JJ, no," Kiara protested, trying to lower his arm. "Look, he was shipwrecked, okay? That storm was as bad as Aggie, a few years ago, right? You said so yourself." She was kneeling beside him now, willing him to drop the gun. "And besides, we heard about the Louisa hitting the reef on TH radio." JJ looked into Kiara's face, beautiful Kiara who hated with as much passion as she loved. He fired the gun, and then let his hands drop, about to kiss her. JJ looked at his girlfriend's face, and then, he looked where she was looking. He was the first to put out his hand to the sand and from it, pull out a treasure. It was a gold Belcher chain. On it, A very large, very old-looking coin,